Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup, Episode 11, Patches, the emblematic embroidery item. Hi, everybody. Welcome once again to the Takeup. I am Erich Campbell, if you didn't already know from however you managed to get over here today. And I am happy to have you in to talk about patches. Patches are something that I love very much. Patches, emblems, and all manner of embroidered shields and blazonry. It is something that I am very passionate about. And so I have to bring this to you because it just keeps coming up and up and up lately, especially as everybody, a lot of us at least, are sheltered in place and maybe kind of working without as much material as we're used to working on. So I'm going to talk briefly about different methods of patch making for sure. We're going to talk a little bit about patch attachment to some degree. Definitely going to cover some different topics on how patches get done, how you can do them, and the different methods I've used to work on patches. So before I get started, let's go ahead and talk to a few people in the comments. Love to see all the people showing up. Bill says, almost time waiting like a microwave to finish the last 30 seconds. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to give you the extreme joy of a microwave burrito, but I will try and give you enough value that I'm better than your average microwave meal. Christine, hello, hi. Glad to see you here. Justin Armenta, hello. Justin, happy to have you here too. Jeff, always glad to have you in the chat and in the comments. Mike, yes, you know you had to be there for this one. Well, I know you wanted to be here for that. You talk about patches a lot too. Certainly something that many of us do. Making patches is definitely on the menu, especially right now. Like I said, there's reasons why patches are especially important right now. Glad to see Tom Farr, also awesome embroiderer. Tom does great stuff with patches and actually has taught lots of people the plastic patch method, which I'll talk about quite soon as we go on here. Daryl, always good to see you, spreading positivity. Happy to have you here. Hello, Dominic. Glad to have you here. Andy, happy to have you here as well. New technique for you. Looking forward to learning about it. Well, you know what? This is something where many people think of patch making as a difficult technique, think that it's going to be something that's quite hard to do. But the thing is, depending on which method you use to make your patches, it can be quite simple. And actually, before we start fully into patch making methods, into things that are technical, I would like to start just with some news, because I like to bring up some news and things that I've seen recently. And it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about patches today. So let's just bring this up. This is something actually from Images magazine. So this is coming in out of the UK. And here's the thing. All Points West Embroidery is creating a fundraising badge for the NHS. You may know the NHS over there is the National Health Services. Well, we are now making patches, at least All Points West. So here's an embroidery company making patches, making badges, so that they can sell them as a fundraiser. And I think this is a great idea, especially because the way I'm looking at this, and now I'm going to talk about this technically just a little bit, I believe this is probably a mostly thread or thread-only patch, very likely made on the MFS system or by a plastic method where you're using mostly just thread and a plastic substrate to make the patch. So this is something that is mostly made of thread. So it's something that you can make in any color with what you have in your shop right now, especially if you already have set up for this. If you either have, say, a Madeira MFS system, we're going to talk about that in a moment, which is one of the ways you can use a plastic substrate to make patches, or if you're using the vinyl method where you use 20 gauge vinyl and sew patches, you can make them where the entirety of what's showing, the entirety of the color involved, is actually thread. So this is one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly anyway. But this is the really cool thing about it, is that you can take this right here, make something, sell it, and you have objects in hand saleable out of the material that you have now. And to see it being used this way so they can raise money for hospital charity is incredibly awesome. And I would say with a lot of people who are kind of stuck right now, where you're not being able to do the things you are used to doing. Maybe you're having trouble getting supplies. Maybe you don't have apparel coming in. Patches are an awesome option. And film like this is a pretty cool idea. Now, Jeff actually brings this up, and I'm going to bring his comment in because it's actually true. When we're going to talk about the plastic method later, the Madeira film is really cool, but it is a lot of stitches. Absolutely. It's a lot of stitches to get coverage. My preferred method is absolutely to use a fabric, to use a polyester twill, if you're wondering. Polyester twill is the gold standard here, folks, for patches. If you're thinking about what a classic patch is made out of, any patch you get off the line, it's going to be polyester twill. When you go get a patch blank, in fact, these are always going to be polyester twill pretty well. And polyester is great for multiple reasons, but I really do like to use polyester twill. It's fine grained as well. Stiffness in a patch. if I can start with one technical thing, stiffness in a patch is not something you get out of using super coarse, super hard materials. Usually it's used support materials. Usually you're using something like crinoline, which is the kind of webbing you'll see sometimes on a commercial patch on the back of them. I actually have patches all over my desk here, folks. So if I'm looking around like a crazy person, it's because I'm thinking, do I have a sample that has some crinoline on the back so I can show you? I think I actually do. You'll see in the back of this patch, you may see it, there's kind of a grid. This looks hazy, right? But this patch actually has some crinoline that's embedded with the embroidery, and that actually makes it stiffer. Also, you'll see that's shiny. That has a thermoplastic adhesive on it, and that thermoplastic adhesive, once that's heat pressed on, can also add some stiffness. So what I see a lot of people doing, if there's one mistake I can call out immediately, especially people in kind of the home or craft side or people who are just starting with patches, you go out there and get super coarse canvas or super coarse cotton duck, because what you think of in your mind, you think of patches as stiff. Stiff is one thing, but coarse is another. So yeah, fine-grained polyester twill is what we're looking for. We can add the stiffness to it. And so buckram or crinoline, depending on what you're looking at. Jeff actually mentioned that in the comments as well. Buckram can be used. Yeah, buckram, crinoline, something like that can be used to add that stiffness if you want. But really, most of the time, if you're getting patches that you're doing that, it is not the fabric itself that adds that stiffness. And Kimberly says, where do you buy that? I don't have one supplier for crinoline or buckram. I know that you can get it from Madeira, since I've gotten a lot of my patch materials from there. But certainly you can get that crinoline from multiple sources. But yeah, Madeira has it, certainly, if you're looking for it and you're already using them for other materials. I know they've got easy crinoline as one of their backings. But as with most things that are stabilizers and backings, it's usually available from multiple distributors and probably from the same few sources who are creating it. So crinoline, buckram, both good for making stiffness in patches, depending on how you're cutting those. But one of the easiest ways to make patches, frankly, is to use pre-made patches. And so before we get too far into this, I'm just going to go ahead and pull up one other thing on my other side here, and that is a couple different articles that I've written just to show you something. Everybody tells me, they're like, oh man, have you heard, like the patch trend is really coming along right now. The patch trend's been going on. Let me tell you this post from my blog right here, Patch It Up, How to Get In on the Patch Trend, was written quite some time ago. So this first time that I started talking about patches, when Urban Threads, you can see, which is a stock design manufacturer, started doing patches. When you see all this stuff here, this set of posts that I started out writing patches, this is from 2016. So anybody out there who's saying, oh yeah, the patch trend is really kicking off, the patch trend has been kicking off for 6+ years. Now, admittedly, patches on hats, the different ways we use patches, it has become very normal to sew patches on hats. When I first came into the industry, a patch on a hat was really seen as archaic, was seen as a weird way to handle things and of lower quality. Nobody wanted big trucker patches with hats on them. Now it is very common to have a big 5-panel cap with a big patch sewn right on the front. So like I said, these things, I think they're here to stay, especially when we're looking at current situations where we may not have apparel on hand. Having a patch involved is something we can use to still be able to deliver decoration to people when they can't bring apparel in, or if they have their own customer supplied apparel, patches are a great way to handle that. So a couple of the different things that I want to say about patches before we go into the technical nature of how to make them. Patches, one of the great things about them generally is that you can use what you have, especially if you already have some soluble backings around. If you have plastic, you've made some patches before. Quite frankly, you can make a patch out of anything if you have the right materials and the right technique in place. Most of the time, it's not a lot of specialty materials to get it to happen. And frankly, I have made them under duress with materials that aren't ideal. You can use tearaway to make a patch. The edge will be awful, usually needs extra cleaning. But patches are really great for using what you have when you absolutely need to decorate something. Frankly, once you get in either like the plastic material, or if you have a water-soluble, heat-soluble kind of substrate to put your patches on, and I, by the way, recommend the fibrous water-soluble. If you're in a crafting location, that would be Violene, is usually the trade name. You'll see that under, it's actually a brand, not the real thing, but that fibrous water soluble that looks more like standard stabilizer is what I use because it holds up to a lot of stitches without tearing out as easily. And that's one of the things you have to watch out with patches always is perforation. Whether you're trying to use plastic or a soluble stabilizer, especially the clear film style soluble stabilizers, the quicker you perforate the outside edge, the quicker that thing's going to start losing its ability to hold up under all the stitching. So you don't want to perforate your edge any sooner than you have to. But yeah, this is a great thing for using what you have. I have made patches hand cut very much like an applique, and all I had that was special was the soluble stabilizer underneath or the plastic. And you can then use any kind of material that will hold up to being stitched with the design to make your patch. Now, honestly, you'll want to stabilize it if it's something loose, but I've used everything from scraps from leftover backpacks, just nylon, to cotton duck, to any of those things, even the coarse stuff, as long as you understand how it's going to affect the look of the finished patch. So patches are great for using what you have. And like I said earlier, if you're using a plastic method or the Madeira MFS frames, which I will go ahead and hold one of those up. This is a Madeira MFS system, manual frame system, and these are the plastic substrate frames that you use with it, that you stitch on. If you're using something like that, you can even use just thread to make a patch in any color you have thread for. So it is great for using what you have. So patches are fantastic for that, for being able to use the materials you have on hand to create a decoration anytime you need it. And this is the other reason I love patches. They are non-sized items. Number one, if you're doing them for fundraisers, you're doing them for, honestly, for any group that may have issues with sizing or for whom you need to add a couple of designs to something or add a couple of pieces after a run is done. Patches are awesome because you can apply them after the fact to garments, either customer supplied garments or things that you have around without having to stitch on them. You can do them quite quickly, especially if you have the patches pre-made as part of a fulfillment program. So patches really can fill a hole in a product line, especially if you're putting together team or company product lines that where patches are acceptable. The other thing is for unhoopable items. The first reason I got into patches at all was in order to address bags that could not be stitched on. I was running into golf bags that didn't originally have stitchable panels on them. They didn't have pockets that could be opened. They couldn't be mounted under a machine with ease. And for those items that weren't going to be worn, I was using a heavy glue to hold those on. So we were using an adhesive to hold those on. But I made patches and even put in a faux stitch around the outside edge so it looked like I had stitched these patches directly onto the items. And that enabled me to deal with unhoopable items. Then you may also find there are certain items I've had heavy horse tack, things like that, where I wouldn't want to stitch an entire logo through it. It's something that I wouldn't be happy to run a bunch of detailed work on, perhaps, for something that's very coarse, but I could create a patch and stand to run a straight stitch through it, either manually on a machine or to run that on my embroidery machine after the fact once the patch was made. So it also allows you to work with difficult items that are not great for embroidery. Even sometimes things like heavy nap, Sherpa jackets. So you can use a nap tack down stitch or a knockdown stitch like Brilliance has, and that's their trademark, believe it or not, the term knockdown. You can actually use that nap tack and stitch to knock it down, sure. But the other thing you can do is add patches and sew those down so that you don't have interference from, like I said, fibers or anything that's going to cause issues with your embroidery in your garment. And the last thing is for customer supplied. I have had some issues with customer supplied pieces, and especially expensive customer supplied pieces that were easy to damage. Honestly, hey, motorcycle stuff, we all know motorcycle stuff is pretty common to use patches. Now, these are actually, the pieces I'm going to hold up are props. They were actually for a TV show, but we all know motorcycle patches. It's a pretty common thing to put on jackets, right? Well, sometimes I'd have my motorcycle people bring in vests that were worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars, leather vests. And instead of direct embroidery, even on some things where they might have wanted direct embroidery, using a patch enabled me not to put that many holes in a piece of leather. As you know, once you put the holes in leather, the holes are there forever. So patches are great for, like I said, non-sized items. They're great to add to a product mix. Unhoopable items, things that you cannot get under a hoop, cannot get a needle through, you can add a patch to, especially with adhesives, and for dealing with some customer supply items. So these are some of the reasons why patches are pretty great to have in the mix. If you haven't thought about it in a business sense, that's one of the things you can think about. Also, I'd like to pitch to everybody, just because a mass-produced patch is $2 to $5 doesn't mean that your custom patch should be that. You are providing more value with a custom patch than with a mass-produced patch, wherein someone is making thousands and thousands in an emblem shop. So people often say to me, hey, but I can't do patches for the prices they have online. And I'm like, no, you can't. But that's not the price you should be commanding for something that's custom. So yeah, also, Let's see here. We have some questions. I'm going to jump into the comments for a minute. You have to pardon me if I'm scattered. There's so many things going on with patches and emblems that I really want to get to, and I don't want to go super, super long today. So I may be jumping around a little bit trying to get them all sorted out. But let's jump back into the comments here. Everybody's asking about buckram. Jeff says you can buy that at Joann's Fabrics. Yeah, craft stores often have some buckram. So yeah, buckram, crinoline, both good things to use. Kimberly says, do you use heat cut for the cutting? Actually, you know what? I don't usually use that. What I usually do is act very much like I'm stitching an applique on a water-soluble stabilizer, a heavy water-soluble stabilizer, and rinse it out. But that's one of the methods you can use is hot cut. But remember, for heat cutting, you're going to have to use that polyester. You need some sort of material that can be cut with a hot knife. Now, the other thing I'm going to mention to you guys, though people call it a hot knife and you think of it as specialty equipment, the hot knife that's most sold with kits, patch kits, is a standard wood burning pen. It's right off the craft aisle. And in fact, some people find that using the chisel tip is better than a knife tip. People who go and try and get a hot knife that actually has like a razor blade tip, those are too easy to cut the patch themselves, whereas a chisel tip, the kind you would classically use for pyrography for wood burning, tends to ride along the edge just a little bit easier than the knife, whereas the knife might cut in, especially if you're trying to use polyester for your edge stitching. I find a lot of people will also use rayon on their edge stitching, so there's a differential with the melt temperature between the two. So do remember, if you're going to do heat cutting is a great option. It's not perhaps the cleanest edge, but it's a fairly clean edge when you get practiced at it. It does take time, so be ready to take time to manually hot cut a patch with a pen. But it is a wood burning tool. It is not an extreme specialty tool that you can't get. It's a wood burning pen. That's really what is sold. And if you look at actually some of the kits that are out there, they essentially, if you look at the actual pen that you get, there's a brand on it that I won't go and like rat people out or anything, but suffice it to say, the brand on the pen you get in the kit will tell you that it is a kit you could have bought yourself as well. Still fine to get the kit, means you get everything you need, but your wood burning pen at home will cut patch material. So yeah, once again, Jeff puts this forward, and I absolutely agree. Great for covering up oops on other garments. Also, let's say you're running a shop and you have employees. I love patches as a way to recycle garments for employees. If we have a garment that I'm not going to use for sampling material, but that is in the shop and has been damaged, I will often offer, or I have offered previously, to make patches for my employees so that they actually can use the company logo over the dead stock garment. And that's pretty awesome. Plus, when I've had people come in for discounts, sometimes I will hold on to dead stock garments that have damage or have something wrong with them, or return stuff where all it is the logo is somehow incorrect, but we wouldn't be accepted by the customer. And I've helped charities and groups that don't have as much money to be able to get garments and say, hey, these garments we can do for a very low cost or no cost, and you will just pay for putting patches on them and the attachment. So creating the patches, stuff like that. So cutaway, wash away. We were talking about soluble materials. Absolutely. Christine Shreve says Q102 would work with patches. It absolutely does. It's what I use. So that's Enmart's branded version, Q102, which is a fibrous water soluble, and you really do, you stitch onto it like an applique. Do your finished edge last. That's what I always recommend everybody do. Your central material first, finished edge last, so you don't perforate it or weaken that stabilizer, and then you can actually run it that way. Or the other option you can do, folks, is that you can stitch out your patch and cut it out. You can use it on a whole cloth without pre-cutting, because I was talking about pre-cutting like an applique. You can stitch it out on cloth, cut the entire thing out from the fabric like this. This is a pre-edged patch. This is cut out having been run, but it hasn't been edged yet. And then you only do the edging as the last step on the soluble material. And that way you don't have the central material here. And by the way, since people like these things, I like to draw ambigrams. If you don't know what an ambigram is, this particular one is rotational ambigram. It's the same both directions. See, it says stitches. If I rotate it 180 degrees, it still says stitches. So that's just fun. But yeah, that's a pre-edged patch. You can also sew your central material and only do the edging last. And you can do that essentially with, like I said, with whatever material you want to use. That way you can actually do scissor cutting and edge it at the last moment with your, usually with satin stitch edge. There are other ways to handle that. But yeah, absolutely, Q102 works. BadgeMaster, I'll admit, Christine, thank you for bringing it up. People talk about BadgeMaster for this, and it's called BadgeMaster because it's specifically supposed to be used for patches. But frankly, I'm going to say in my history, I've had issues with almost all of the film type stabilizers, water soluble stabilizers for making patches because of that perforation. The film type tends to release a little easier if you perf too much around an edge. So for me, I don't like them the most. They're not my favorite thing to use. People do use them and successfully. I just don't love them the most. And I'll also say certainly, in New Mexico, super dry climate, I have found that water-soluble film-type stabilizers, if they're not kept very carefully, will have a tendency to become brittle. So if you keep them too long or too dry, they can get brittle on you. And I find that then they're not very much use, especially for patches. Still often fine for just as a topping on top of a garment. Not always great for patches because you're usually putting a lot of stress on that material. Jeff says free bonus time, calling it now. Very likely, Jeff. Very, very likely. Also, we can get back into this too, but simple shapes are run straight to the marrow so fast. Yeah, no, marrowing. And marrowing is the classic edge type. Marrowing, and then here's that patch again. We're going to go ahead and bring that up close if we can get it on screen. If you'll see that kind of edging that's there, this is a proper marrowed edge. This is done with an overlocking sewing machine. It's very much like a serger. It wraps around the outside edge and it's done manually. The limits with marrowing, in my opinion, are that you're not going to get this. This piece with the shapes as is now, it's seen better days because it's been traveling with me quite a bit. Custom tight shapes like this, marrowed, it's really hard to get inside little bitty shapes like this and run them. And this one's actually a full cutout. Perfect edge stuff like this, not happening on a marrow machine. And that's often why I would do my own stuff on soluble materials. Not to say marrow machine is not a great option. Marrowing is great and it's classic. I mean, there's another piece of mine, another one of my ambigrams though, it's got some green in it. So it's going to play with that. When you buy pre-made patch blanks, almost always you're going to get that marrowed edge on them. And that marrowed overlock edge is classic. You can do some things to simulate it. I'm not going to stress it too much because I'm still working on it. Green, you won't see much of it, but I have certainly been working on simulating it myself, and there may be something down the road for us to talk about. But still, that classic marrowed edge is absolutely great, especially for straight edges, simple curves, not real tight curves, generally not real tight corners. You can do it, but then there's overlapping and not everybody loves the look of that in marrowing. But marrowing is classic. You cut out the patch and then you have to run it in a machine manually. The one thing I'll say is most people who buy a marrowing machine, they are not usually ready for the commitment it will take just to kind of get it working for you. It's not that they're super difficult, but not everyone is going to be great the day you pick that thing up. I know in our shop, we've got a marrowing machine, and it is not even people who sew all the time are entirely ready day one. When you watch people marrow online, when they're adding that marrowed edge to patches, that takes practice to get where you're incredibly fast, guys. It's not going to happen day one. I find if you're not making a ton of patches, marrowing may not be your thing. But if you are making patches all the time, if patches become a part of your profit center, absolutely consider a marrowing machine as well. But I'm going to go ahead and skip out, bring in, once again, one of my articles. And this is one that has been kind of around the block a lot. And I think it's about time for me to update it, right? It's about time for me to update this piece. But this is, I essentially want to teach everybody to learn how to make patches on any embroidery machine. And I'm bringing this up just to kind of go back over once more the methods that you can use. And you can see that I've done a lot of these perfect edge, I'm going to call them. They essentially have a satin stitch edge like this. A lot of these perfect edge patches like this for complex shapes, it's just something that I got to doing for my clientele. They were not much for the marrowed patches, and usually the simple marrowed stuff, it's very likely that I would send that stuff off. And even then, a lot of the companies will do these perfect edge hot cut stuff, even when you're going to an emblem company. So yeah, definitely something you want to look at. But this is what I was talking about when I said the soluble method. For me, the first kind of method I really got into was the water-soluble materials. And as you can see, what I was doing is using pre-cuts. This is one of the methods you can use. This particular pre-cut piece was done with a plotter cutter. So imagine like a Graph Tech, a Roland, anything like that that can cut material. And this is actually roll thread material. And I'll just go ahead and say the brand name of what I got. It's not the only place you can get it, but this is from Stahl's. It's pressure sensitive Poly Twill, PS Poly Twill. And I was cutting this on a plotter cutter. So using it pretty much like a normal, what people would consider a vinyl cutter to cut these with a fairly aggressive 60-degree blade. But what you can see underneath there is that I am using a soluble, water-soluble, a fibrous water-soluble material in order to sew those down. So essentially, I'm putting down a placement stitch, I'm putting a tack down stitch, and actually I did something wrong here. I would usually finish more of it before I started edging everything, but I use these tack down stitches to show you. This is me creating patches from those cut pieces. When these are done, you can rinse them out, and they're quite easy to handle. So you just stitch it down, central material. I was actually doing all of the embroidery on it as well. The central material in the embroidery, the design was done at the same time as the edging. You can do them separately. With this heavier fibrous water soluble, I find that you did not have to do that. You really didn't have to run the stuff separately. That was a little harder if you did. If you had a lot of stuff that was going on inside of that design area, sometimes that stuff was a little more prone to tear out if you didn't have something stable. But like I said, the fibrous water soluble tended to be pretty stable. So that's what I would often do for my patches. I would do that and then rinse off the edges. And generally I was doing these for uniforming, for costuming, and a lot of them, they didn't really want a super stiff patch. So I was just running the twill over the stabilizer, rinsing it out, and finishing the edges. That's pretty much all I was doing in that particular set. So that's done with the plotter cutter. However, I also taught people to do badges on home machines, and literally on a home embroidery machine, a nice piece of polyester twill here, same soluble stabilizer. You essentially made your shape, and instead of just doing placement, you'd run that essential border down there to tack it down, define it, and cut away like an applique, and then stitch your material and your edge. There's really not much different to it aside from the amount of time it takes. So like I said, this is something you can do no matter who you are, where you are, what you're using. And as you can see, with these ones, especially because I did not have to have immediate delivery on some of them, I would just go ahead and for a full rinse, clear them out and run those off, let them dry. So that's the thing though. I will say that when you have excess stabilizer and you have to use the water soluble, they have to have time to dry. And that's one of the things that people don't like about the water soluble in general. I've seen people use a heat away film type stabilizer for the same thing, but any of those film type stabilizers, you're going to have to be careful not to get tear out at the edges when you make them. And that's why a lot of people have recently been going to the plastic film patch method, right? So plastic film patch method, generally we're talking about something like I showed you earlier, that Madeira MFS system. These essentially put a plastic frame down, and that frame is held by a system, a hooping system that actually holds this kind of tractor feed frame, and there's a plastic substrate. The plastic will remain inside the patch when you're finished. So unlike the soluble, you're not trying to get rid of it. It remains inside the patch when it's finished, and the patch is mostly made of thread. And in this case, this patch was done, now you can certainly use material instead of the thread, but this particular patch here was done with thread only, making up the body of the patch. And it's very much, if you were somebody who's in the craft market, you're in the home decorative market, this would be very much like a freestanding lace design where you're building a mesh, you're essentially building up fabric out of thread as you sew. And you can see here that I have essentially a mesh going in two directions. If you use the Madeira method, you're going to get a third direction in there before you make your cover stitching and your finished patch. And these here are the patches that we're talking about. And these are thread only. And the other method you can do is very similar. You can do this with 20 gauge vinyl, and it's just vinyl off of the craft store shelf. No lie, 20 gauge clear vinyl, and it's done the same way. The two patches that are sitting here, and I actually have these in my hot hand right now as we speak, these two patches are very, very similar, and they're made in similar methods, right? These two patches here, once again, they're green. I have too much green going on. This green screen is going to kill me, guys. But this patch here was done on the vinyl. This is just 20 gauge vinyl, and I actually have some of that here to show you. This is just literally out of a craft store. There's nothing particularly special about it. 20 gauge vinyl, as you might expect. And this piece was done, once again, thread only on the Madeira MFS system. You're going to find the Madeira MFS, it's thinner, so you get a very pliable patch. And if you don't like a thin patch, you're going to want to stabilize that with something. Or this one's a little thicker, but I find they're a little harder to run than the MFS. Not too much, really not a tremendous amount of difference. The one thing here is I found that you can perforate a little too much on the MFS plastic. It's thin, and if you perf really hard on an edge, if you're not careful about maybe not lining up all of your edge fill penetrations, you can use a little bit of jaggedness along your interior fill. When you first fill this stuff, you can get penetrations where it starts to tear away. And actually, I'm going to flip back over to that screen to show you something real quick. On this, you can see, I actually use this in many of my classes to explain this stuff. And what I use it to do is explain why you should watch your machine run when you're doing a first test on things. you can see that this was starting to pull away. This edge here, that's not just the pressure foot kind of beating up the material. It was starting to pull away and draw because I had actually used a setting that was listed in a PDF that was teaching me how to do their method. I wanted to try their particular method before I digitized my own method. And when I did, it actually had a density point, or actually a stitch length that was off by a decimal point. So I was using tiny, tiny stitches around this edge, and it was starting to perforate and get loose already when I was running this. So they do have instructions on how to use their method to make thread only online, but it is essentially where you get a mesh, a loose density mesh. The settings change depending on who you're listening to on this, but you'll have 2 loose density meshes at least at 45 and 135, and then they will usually have a vertical mesh and then your horizontal fill, or the other way around, a horizontal loose fill and then a full density vertical fill in order to make this happen. And the final edge, it's actually fairly close to the final edge. Mike actually asked this in the comments. The final edge wraps deeply onto that fill in the background in order to keep it all stable and to have this tie in so you don't have the edges coming out separately. And you can see this one actually has vertical fills as the finished fill on this, and this is using the Madeira settings. So those are available from the Madeira MFS, but the same settings will work on a vinyl patch. So that's one of the other methods that you can use, right? So what do we have so far? We've got the water-soluble method, which truthfully doesn't take a lot of extra setup. The water-soluble method, you can essentially treat like an applique and a full density satin stitch border that overlaps onto the applique or patch material deeply. I like to use at least 3 millimeters width. Truthfully, I don't like real thin borders because they tend to be more likely to pull out, or depending on the kind of material you have, if it's not encapsulated, it doesn't have heat seal on it, you can end up with that trying to fray at those edges. I like 3 millimeters is a good way to start, 3 to 4. That stuff doesn't take a lot of special treatment, especially, like I said, the heavier water-soluble stabilizer, or if you're doing something incredibly heavy and you want to use all of the, you want to do all of the embroidery on the stabilizer instead of doing it previously and cutting it out, that can be done on 2 layers of that, and almost nothing is going to tear that apart. It really does not perf the way that the films do, but all of the plastic films have a tendency to perforate on the edge as you're running, and the more density you run, or the more material, the more interior design work you do, if you make clean edges on anything, it has a tendency to want to perf a little bit more, especially than the fibrous stuff. The fibrous water soluble is pretty stable and won't perf the same way. So definitely you have to be very careful with it. Ramona asks, do you hoop the 20-gauge vinyl? I've tried and it's too stiff for the hoops pop. Yeah, you know, I've had that to happen sometimes, but I do hoop it. I have seen people hoop it with clamps assisting the hoops. The other problem is it depends on your hoops. I'll say especially on some of the home-based machines, they tend to have a little harder time with it. Whenever you have a rectangular hoop, you have tension in the corners and you're loose along the edges. Rectangular hoops tend to have more problem with that than a circular hoop. Circular hoop has tension all around the outside ring pretty much evenly. But when you have a rectangular hoop, especially, like I said, a lot of the home machines and the prosumer machines have a rounded rectangle. And whenever you have that, the long edges of that rectangle tend to be loose. If you grab your material and pull, you can feel it pulling in the edges, but it's tight in the corners. It's one of the things that tends to happen, folks. So, and Tom's done a lot of this, so I'm going to bring in his comment also. Make sure the vinyl is not cold. The warmer it is, the easier it is to hoop. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, but I usually work in a warm climate, so I'm going to say that that's something I haven't had issues with. I have had issues with the vinyl being stiff and wanting to pull out, and I have seen people using spring clamps or something else to make it easier to run. And actually, Troy, I'll bring this in. Troy, thank you for your commentary on this. I use a heat gun for shipping around the vinyl to hoop easier. Yeah, so those are, admittedly, I haven't had to do that. Most of the time when I hoop, it's fine. I haven't had a lot of trouble with it hooping, but it is stiff to get in the hoop. Great tips from Tom and Troy. So make sure that that is a little more pliable, and that tends to work very well too. And that's something I've done with, I will say this, the 20-gauge vinyl, as long as your border is not till the end and you're a little bit careful, I've run even very small, fairly detailed pieces. This little Valkyrie piece was done on the 20-gauge vinyl, and this was done actually on a home machine with almost no prep, like almost no prep to the piece. Now it's a fully filled piece where there are pretty regular overlaps throughout. So it is all tied together. The thread is on thread. There's not a lot of open areas. In fact, there's no open areas in it, but with almost no prep, I found that this ran as a patch quite well. The only problem I had with it on the vinyl is that all of my last borders got quite a bit thinner than I would have liked them, and they were thin to start with. I ran this just as a sample to say, can it be done to just throw a design on it? A design that is fully filled like this, that doesn't have too much trouble with the edges being unlocked from the design itself. Yeah, a well underlaid design, it did work. Now, it's not something I would necessarily advise. I would like to see it all tied together, even with a loose mesh very much, like you have to do with the MFS system or the other stuff. I would like to see something tying it all together in that way if you're using thread only, but it was surprisingly pretty forgiving. And Tom brings this up, and I do absolutely agree. For vinyl, you also have to watch the stitching sequence. For me, my rule has just always been you don't get to that edge until the last moment. I do not like to run any part of that edge ahead of time. Even if I put the edge on my screen ahead of time to design around where the inside of my border is going to be, that final edge is going to be the last thing I run. And if I'm using a full fill coming up to the edge, I tend to use a little bit of jaggedness just to try and throw off the perforations. But yeah, Tom, if you have any other tips that you want to throw out in the comments, I will absolutely bring those up too. So like I said, plastic method does work. MFS is a little different. I'm actually going to bring up one more thing about the MFS that's interesting about it. This manual frame system, actually, once you lock in these frames, number one, there is an automated version of this thing. These are actually, they come on a tractor feed. As you can see, if you've ever seen an old school printer that had tractor feed, there is a method by which they have these where it'll automatically kick in the next frame and allow you to mass produce patches on a single head machine. So there is such a thing from the Madeira people, but it's not something that I have in any case. But that is something I have seen. But the MFS system is pretty interesting because it actually is made up of two edges here, right? What we're going to see is there are two parts of this fixture. The one part of the fixture is the frame that's on the inside, and this holds that frame, right? It holds that plastic sheet. And then this particular piece locks down inside of what's a fairly standard hoop. Now, what's interesting about this is that you can run the patch inside of this and then hoop a garment behind that piece. You can hoop it behind that pre-done piece, even previous to putting the edge on, and then use the edge to affix it to a garment. Why is that interesting? Because you can also use patches as a way to mitigate problems with performance material. If you have something that's incredibly light that doesn't hold up well to a heavy design, you can actually create the heavy design as something applied as an applique. And as I showed you earlier, when you're using the MFS, it's actually quite pliable, quite soft. It can be folded and it's not bulletproof, even with a full coverage, because of the pliable nature of that plastic. And then you can use that essentially to apply a design to something thin, something that will not hold up. And these actually lock in and index pretty well to the point where you can also make your patches ahead of time. And then they index to these little pegs that are present here. You'll see this little dot. It's actually a little peg that sticks out. There's a little spike that probably has a little shine on it right there. You can index a pre-made frame back into this system later, so you can make patches ahead of time and then put them back in this hoop system to affix them to garments. So that's something that you can only do with the MFS system that I've seen so far, but it is something else interesting you can use. Now, certainly you can do other things with plastic patches. You can use them in multiple ways, but this makes it easier to index them and to attach them to a garment. So that's something else that's interesting as well. Cindy, I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. How do you get the edge with no plastic showing? Honestly, with the MFS system and with the vinyl method, when you tear it out, it is not particularly visible. You may see little tiny bits of the plastic, but with the clear plastic, it's very much not visible. I have not had much trouble with it causing trouble. So those particular, the Madeira plastics and the 20 gauge vinyl plastic, I find that there's some texture to it. Even when it's perforated, if you feel the edge of one of these plastic patches, you can feel that there are little picks, little bits of that still remaining, but it tears pretty cleanly out once you pop it out of the frame, and I haven't had much trouble with that. Now, personally, I prefer the water-soluble method. The water-soluble method, when you use that, you have zero edge. It has nothing left. There is nothing there. Why? Because I've made sure to leave a small gap outside of the material of the patch where it is only thread making up this edge. When I wash away my stabilizer, it's gone and it's unsupported. It's just thread at the edge, and then I get a perfectly clean edge. And I will actually bring this in as well. Ramona says you can also use a heat gun to shrink it to the edges. Be careful not to burn. Yes, you can, but very much be careful. Yes, because the material itself, the plastic, I find you don't want to hit that with a lot of heat. But yeah, the edge I find is not particularly bad. Now, all right, Mike says maybe software specific, adding the jagged edges to regions of a previously done fabric design for her fabric or hats. Honestly, depending on what software you use, almost all softwares, and Brilliance has it, Willcom, everybody's going to have some sort of jaggedness or feathering or some setting like that. If you digitize the design, you have the original, or if you have the working file yourself, the file that's native to the digitizing software, you should be able to add some jaggedness. Usually it's a percentage, and it usually has an amount of variation as well as a percentage for the distance of jaggedness. And this is something that I'm going to say is not super critical all the time, but I like to use some jaggedness just to try and prevent any clean lines that are going to cause a clean perforation that tears away. Because admittedly, if the reason we're using a material is because we expect it to tear away and have a clean edge, then if we know we're perforating something before we get to the end of the design, we are introducing a weakness. We're making that perforation so that it tears away. And then if we start adding more stress to the design or running things on it, absolutely that's going to have a higher chance of tearing away. But that's also why I use the water-soluble stabilizer. The water-soluble, fibrous water-soluble, not the film type, it holds up to a lot of abuse. So if you're concerned about that, or you don't want to do multiple, like I said, you don't want to do multiple processes. You don't want to like stitch your item and then cut it out and then applicate it down and then do the edge. If you're trying to get out of doing those multiple processes, but you're okay with washing those patches out and letting them dry somewhere flat, if that's okay to you, if just having less of the time in prep spent manually working on the patches is a thing for you, then the water-soluble fibrous stabilizer, that wash-away stabilizer, I find to be quite useful for that particular reason. So yeah, that's why I use the water-soluble fibrous. It holds up to more abuse. It holds up to more work. You can do a lot of stitching in the center of a design and have it come out all right. And like I said, almost all the samples you'll see here, a lot of these are all done for really, they're done for costuming. These are mostly done for shooting for TV shows. This is like the night shift. We have some stuff here. This is from Better Call Saul, several movies. And the funny thing is you end up with different versions of the same thing. These are all the Albuquerque police patches, and they're different versions. Why different movies end up with different versions once you do these. Another one here for the night shift. Another one here for let's see, Soldado, the second Sicario movie. But all of these were done with water-soluble fibrous stabilizer. It was just an easy thing to do. And when they're being sewn on, especially if you've got like for me, my wardrobe people didn't want these things to look like brand new, shiny, have never been worn patches. They wanted them to be flexible and to look good sewn onto a garment. For those, not using any crinoline or buckram and just having that the twill involved was enough for them, and that's what they liked. If you have to have something stiffer, then certainly you're going to look at maybe applying thermoplastic adhesive and the buckram or the crinoline to it. And if you're doing things that you want them to be heat pressed, then obviously you're going to want to use thermoplastic adhesive. And that kind of brings me to the other method that we haven't really talked about too much here. Let me bring this back in again. And the last one is like hot knife cutting. And certainly this piece right here, this is the water soluble again. I'll show you this. This is all done that water soluble, like I said, but hot knife cutting is absolutely a thing that you can do. The hot knife cutting, essentially, you stitch the entire thing on a spanned hooped amount of stabilizer. You can often hoop your other materials with it when you're doing the hot knife cutting, and you are running a hot, essentially wood burning tool, chisel tip, along the edge of the border after you're done cutting through the polyester. So for that, people use that, especially when you're doing thermoplastic adhesives, because this allows you to put the thermoplastic adhesive on after you've done your first stitching and often previous to the last line of stitching. And then you can use your hot cut knife to cut the thermoplastic adhesive as well. You'll press that on to the material after you've done your stitching. You press it onto the back of the entire span, and then you can cut the patch out, and it cuts the adhesive to the edge at the same time. So pretty frequently people are using the hot knife for that. Now, personally, I wasn't doing a lot of adhesive in most of my patches. When I did, I was doing it after the fact, and I still had to cut the adhesive after it was applied pretty often. But for me, Most of the time I was stitching my patches on. Both my clients that were kind of the motorcycle clients I had wanted them stitched and often would pay for us to do the stitching in-house. And the clients that we did for the movies, they were going to stitch those themselves. So most of my clients wanted stitched on patches, were not interested in the thermoplastic adhesive. And that's probably one of the other reasons you don't see me often doing hot knife cutting, because I didn't have the need of using that hot knife. I find that it's a slow process. It's not my favorite. I have seen people do a method where they will add the thermoplastic adhesive and do almost like a hot peel where they try and tear through the adhesive on the edges of the patch. It's something that I have not really done myself. When I've had to use thermoplastic adhesive, I was usually cutting that adhesive myself, cutting the adhesive sheets. And I find that to be a pretty slow process myself. The other kinds of adhesive work I've done is when, like I said, using things that were not to be worn. I used a heavier contact adhesive for stuff like that. And frankly, that's not something I necessarily recommend these days. There are better adhesives out there. Back in the day, we used a contact adhesive that was not the least toxic thing on earth, and it's not something I would have done for garments. So for me, most of the garment work, I was sewing them on, especially because if you do them as embroidery, they have a very stable edge. Marrowed patches, especially if you have them pre-made, one of the issues you can come into with a proper marrowed patch is that with the marrowed patches, often the edges are not exact. If you try and put them on your machine, you'll find that there are these little lumps and bumps and kind of not exact edges. So trying to put a patch on a hat, trying to put a patch on a garment using an embroidery machine means that there's always a little bit of slop in that edge you're trying to deal with. So for me, the other reason I liked to make my own patches on the embroidery machine, because I could also then have a very stable edge, a dimension and size and shape that I was sure of, so that I could use the embroidery machine for attachment as well. So that's one of those things that's a little hard. So yeah, Tom says, do I add adhesive to my patches? I often did not, but that's really my clientele. If I had a clientele who wanted to have these heat pressed, I would add adhesive. I did often add Velcro to the patches, but that ranged depending on who I was doing it for. If it was supposed to be a temporary patch, sometimes there are Velcros that have strong adhesives, or I'll say hook and loop instead of the brand name. There's hook and loop where you get hook that had a really strong adhesive. You could literally cut it and press it on by hand, and that contact adhesive would not come off. We sometimes did that. Other times we would sew it on manually. Other times I would use a run stitch on my embroidery machine and run it through the Velcro on the back of the patch previous to finishing it up. All of these things were done when I was attaching Velcro, and it really depended. But once again, I come from a shop that also had a manual sewing portion of it. We would also do letter jacket patch attachment, things like that pretty regularly. So we had industrial machines with straight stitch functions, steps from the embroidery machines. It means that I'm definitely going to have a different take on it generally when you're talking about my personal experience. Certainly, sewing on Velcro is often done manually. If not, it was done with jigs or placements where it was done almost like an inverted applique onto a patch that was pre-made. So that kind of thing was done. And actually, I know I've seen, I believe it was Matthew Underlay who comes on here sometimes and who's in the Nerd group, who uses an actual frame. He makes a jig that helps to position the patches. Yeah, and that's what Jeff's saying. He has a good method for sewing Velcro, where he essentially uses a thick jig that can be set into a hoop, and it allows you to place the patch very reliably and then use a straight stitch to sew the Velcro underneath that patch and attach it. That is something that I've certainly done myself as well. Not using a jig method the way he does, but that does help you to automate that somewhat. And actually, I'm going to bring this up since people kind of brought up the cap thing. I'm going to skip forward a little bit and talk about this. Easy ways to sew patches on hats. I'm going to go ahead and bring this in. This is not an easy way, but when I've been called upon to talk about sewing patches on hats, what I find the problem usually is there are a couple problems that are coming together when people are sewing patches on hats. Generally, you're having a problem with the patch itself. If you're having patches produced by an emblem company and you're having them marrowed, you may have an edge that is not exactly stable in a shape that you can constantly use. It's not exactly the same shape every time. So you end up having to do kind of your best estimate for positioning. And so it gets hard to get them dead straight on the hat, even if you're not having other problems. And the other problem that people are often having is that the hat itself is shifting. And usually there are multiple reasons why the hat's shifting. Often you're using a structured hat where the crown has a tendency to shift as the presser foot comes down. You've got this structured hat that tends to flex as you press the presser foot down. When it does that, it shifts all out of register and it causes issues. Couple of the things that you can do if you don't have a super difficult patch, sometimes all you need is a very small amount of underlay. This is for a hat that's not causing a great deal of shifting. And this essentially, you can see that it has a tree that will sew out from the center. I call it a tree. It's the best way I can describe it. It's like the veins on a leaf. It sews out from the center back to the bottom, then a line up on one side and then on the other. And this stabilizes the crown out from the center and sews it down to the stabilizer, provided your hat is hooped correctly. You've got all the teeth where they belong. The straps are where they belong. You have a good full wrap of stabilizer that's holding it down to the back. This may be enough to do it. And then you have a line that's on the inner edge of the patch running, right? That's one of the things you can do. The other thing you can do is actually use a light density fill, vertical fill from the center out to kind of press down the hat. And I actually don't have that up right now. It's something where had some bandwidth issues with everybody going live these days. Bandwidth issues are real. I wanted to do some live video stuff, but if I do live video stuff on top of what I'm doing here, sometimes I have some issues. But in this fill method, you go from the center and do an underlay that tacks down a vertical fill that's loose to one side, and then on the other side, and you tack the entire area underneath the patch down to the crown. So the crown tacks down to the stabilizer underneath with this loose vertical fill. It smashes the entire area under the patch flat and makes it as flat to the needle plate as it can be. Then you place your patch as normal, probably using some adhesive. Some people are using tape. There's multiple ways people are doing this. Often I've seen people using little pieces of double stick tape. However you're doing it, you stick the patch down as you would, and then people are running a tack down stitch, often a triple stitch or a bean stitch, something that's nice and thick, because often the look you're trying to get is intentionally a stitched down patch. And actually, Tom says this, uses underlay and tacks on the sides before running the triple stitch. Yeah, and he actually does something that is great for positioning and placement, and he will add a small tack stitch on each side. It gives you one last chance that that patch is not holding into place the way it should be. You can actually take it off because there's only a couple of tacking stitches on either side before you start. And that's the thing. And Cindy says, is that your global tacking? Yeah. The global underlay, that's actually a term that Embroidery's creator Brian Bailey kind of came up with a long time ago. It's funny that I kind of came to it in the same way. That global underlay, where you underlay an entire area, it's not exactly the same as global underlay, but it is very similar, right? When we're talking about global underlay for a design, that can be very similar, but this is specifically to tack the material down. It's not to hold stitches up because we're putting a patch on top of it. It should be either fully stitched or made out of a material, an applied material. But what it does do is it does something very similar. It has a very loose density vertical fill that runs this on one direction out and then back to the other direction out. So it's both doing what I call the tablecloth method. It's spreading the material of the crown out toward the outside edges, like you're spreading a wrinkled tablecloth on a table, gets all that wrinkles out of the way, right? And it is literally, lest we forget, an embroidery machine is a sewing machine. It's an interlock sewing machine. We are sewing the crown to the stabilizer, right? We're sewing it down to the stabilizer and flattening it out and spreading it from the center. When we do that, we end up with a nice, flat, stable area in the crown of the hat that is now more likely not to shift and will take the patch better. So that's what it is. It's not exactly global underlay, but it's very, very similar. You might as well call it the same. The thing that's different about it is global underlay, if it's on a flat, might go from any direction. It's not necessarily from the center out, even though I tend to do center out because often on performance material, stretchy material, working from the center out will keep puckers and wrinkles out of your way. Very similar thing, tablecloth method, work from the center out. But for this particular reason, it's actually to sew down the crown of the cap and flatten it out. And those are ways to attach to the crown. Now, what I'm going to be honest about is that a lot of my friends who do lots of patches on caps, especially if they start getting into fast production, I've seen tons of them go buy a post-bed sewing machine and get somebody who's trained or train somebody up on doing it manually. Especially people who are doing lots of leather, or if they want to do very precise placement of that tack down line at the end. Some of them will do that manually and have people who are just great practitioners of sewing, if you will say that. I've had some discussions about what you call people. I have a tendency because my mother actually was a seamstress. She worked at a plant for a while that made jeans, that made Levi's. And so I say seamstress pretty often, but I know that there are people of every gender who are out there making things and sewing, so I don't like to say seamstress all the time. But it's something, because my mom described herself, she described herself as a seamstress, I have a tendency to say seamstress ahead of time. But usually people are getting someone who is skilled to use that post-bed machine. And if you've never seen a post-bed sewing machine, instead of having a flat base where your needle plate is, there is a post sticking up. So here's your post sticking up with your needle plate here. And so you can put a rounded item and turn it, something curved, concave, and inside of that convex side of it, you can turn it on that bed. And that's how we use that for sewing on the hats. It makes it easier for that. And honestly, I've seen people who are using it for sleeves and shoulders for leather jackets. I know we did a lot of leather sleeve leather jackets, and doing those on a flat machine is miserable, especially as you get further down into the sleeve. People are using the post beds for that as well. So post bed sewing machine is another way to do it. Now, certainly, absolutely, sewing on patches can be done with an embroidery machine. We did it quite a lot, and especially when we had areas on the garments where it was something we could do. And doing it on hats, yes, you can do it on hats with an embroidery machine. Can be a little more difficult once you get a technique in mind and you perfect that technique. It gets better, but like I said, some people don't really love to do it on that way anyway. So yeah. And I agree with Cindy. That's a problem with leather jacket patches and doing it on the hand, method, using the post bed, using any sort of sewing machine. It ties up your hands. And yeah, that is an absolute true thing. Unfortunately, it is very difficult to do that sometimes. So that's the thing, man. That is the issue with that, is that sometimes it is difficult to do that patch attachment. Though I will say the method Tom described, the method I described, where you add that underlay ahead of time that spreads your cap out and flattens the area, absolutely will get you better results than if you don't. If you just try and stick that round patch on the front of your hat or any shape patch and just run around it, you're also going around in one direction. So the material of the hat as it flexes is rocking around that needle plate, and it's more likely to be off than if you flatten it out first. So flatten it out first if you can. Like I said, some people go to the post bed machines, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. I find that if you have somebody really fast on that, especially if you do have crew, it's not just you, then that's something that you can do. But otherwise, yeah, you can work with it on a machine. Flattening things out does help quite a bit. And Carolyn says she prefers to put them on the machine because physically it's getting too hard to push all that fabric through, and it's faster. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing. It really depends on what your primary goal is. It's the same thing with the patch backgrounds, right? Or the stabilizers that you use. For me, water-soluble stabilizer meant that no one was manually doing any work to it. I've seen people doing the hot knife, and they like the edge they get, and it makes it easier, especially when you're putting a thermoplastic adhesive sheet on the back, because you can cut everything in one step. For those of you who are doing that, absolutely it makes things easier. Absolutely it can be a time saver. For me, I was never putting thermoplastic adhesive on, or at least so infrequently that it's not something I really planned ahead or thought of as part of my process. For me, being able to rinse the patches out and leave them somewhere, yeah, I was cool with them having to be wet and having to be dried, because that was not manual work that somebody was doing. That means their hands were free to do something else. They were free to go on to another task. So for me, yes, it means more time, more prep, but it meant that I could free someone's hands up to do something else, and then they're not cutting with a manual tool. Now, there are other ways to handle this. Trust me. I have seen many people doing different forms of soluble materials. If you have a bridge laser, if you have a hot cutter, you'll see on the ZSK machines, like the one that I have in my picture back here, ZSK has a hot air cutting station that you stick on the one end of the system, and you can do hot cut out of sheet material and do it essentially like an applique, and then use any other of the methods underneath it to get your background done. That can make this stuff really fast if you have some sort of cutting method like that, or pre-cuts. Like I told you before, I used to use roll-fed stock material, but a lot of people use lasers these days to get their pre-cuts, and I find the pre-cut with the soluble stabilizer or with the plastic to be the fastest method for me. So it really just depends on what your top priority is. If your top priority is clean edges with thermoplastic adhesive, then you may want to go with the hot knife. Hot knife might work for you, especially because you don't have to do anything funny on the machine. On the machine, you're spanning up polyester. You are spanning up the entirety of the stabilizer and everything in one big hoop. You can hoop it all. It's all solid and framed. And you're cutting it all after the fact. So there's no placement. There's no chance for the cuts to go off place. You don't have to use adhesives to get things together in the hoop. So that's the great part about hot cut. If you're like me and you don't want to do hot cut and there's no benefit to it, you don't want that manual work. For me, the pre-cuts that were done with the roll fed cutter, with the laser, placement stitches, it didn't take very long. And especially using the roll fed stuff I did, it was called, what I said, PS Poly Twill, pressure sensitive. What does that mean? It has a sticky adhesive on it from the factory, which meant I could literally stick it in the hoop like a sticker following my placement line. And once I did that, all I had to do is place that in there and run my tack down stitch and I was done. And I could even run multiples in one hoop, because if I use that water soluble, the fibrous water soluble will hold up to a lot more stitching and would allow you to go ahead and get multiples spanned in a hoop. I am not always a fan of doing multiples, because sometimes if you're doing heavy material or having a lot of edging done, it may start to come loose. And then as you start to run more and more patches, it can really cause issues. But with that water-soluble fibrous stabilizer, especially if I was using 2 layers of that stuff, fairly bomb-proof, and I was able to run tons of them and just stick down my individual cuts as I was going. Something that was very simple for me to do, but that's not something everybody's going to do. And honestly, there are other things coming on down the road. I have already seen, sadly, the trade shows being shut down means not everybody else is going to get to see it, but ZSK this year had a computer vision system where they were not only edging patches manually, you could stick anything down and their computer system was finding it, and you could then add designs, add other like text to the patch, and it was orienting it in space, and it could see all the edges. It was something there, and I can actually see this is something that we were talking about with Jeff here in the comments. Matthew, was he working on shape recognition, and he was still working on a webcam to do shape recognition. And I've seen commercial people doing that too, where they're recognizing the edge of a patch and then addressing it that way. And like I said, I saw ZSK running that on a single head machine already. That's something that's coming along too. Patches are still there. There's still things that are being worked on in that vein, both obviously, as we see from Matthew here, on a user standpoint, and we've seen these coming down commercially from the machine manufacturers. So machine manufacturers are thinking in that same way. How can we make it easier to attach a patch or throw one down, add something to a patch? These things are coming. But the thing is, one of the things I love about patches, and as we're going to close this up, because we're getting past an hour, I have been all over the place. It's been a fairly disorganized version of the Takeup today because there's so much to do with patches. There's so many methods. It's not one single animal. The cool thing about patches is you can do it with just about any level of technology you want to. If you have a scissor, some sort of stabilizer that either tears away cleanly and doesn't show an edge like the plastic, not my favorite, but you can do it. It does work quite well and good for production. Or the water soluble, if you want an absolutely clean edge, you have a scissor, you have material, you have that kind of stabilizer, some stabilizer that lets this happen, and a machine, and you can make patches. That is all you absolutely must have, is some way to cut the patch material either in the hoop or out. If you can do applique, you can make a patch, right? Or you can go all the way out to bridge lasers. You can do computer vision. You can do as much technology as you want to add to this, you can. The other thing you can do, and this is, I know, blasphemy, because this is an embroidery show, sublimation. And this, once again, green. I should have thought better. I don't think I have any other sublimation on me, but this is a sublimated patch, not stitched, that has a mirrored edge. And I sublimated this material. So once again, polyester, because it is a solid polyester blank, you can even get pre-made patches and sublimate on those. Patches are everything from sewing something with no edging on a pre-edged blank, something you buy like this, say from a company like Enmart, where they make these pre-edged blanks in standard shapes, and you add a design to it. Everything from that up to and including custom cut, custom shapes, fully embroidered, partially custom, where you're doing cut shapes on a roll cutter. So this is a vinyl cutter, all the way up to the lasers. Any amount of technology you have, you are capable of making a patch. The only thing you have to work on with this is pricing. When we're working on patches, it's easy to forget the pricing or try and price these things on a cost per thousand like you would do any other time for a normal decoration, but you have to build in the value of what a patch is. So remember that there are pin and patch collecting clubs. We don't necessarily see a whole lot of people styling themselves as, professional promotional polo shirt collectors. Patches have value by being the thing that they are. And they have value to us because they are non-sized items we can add to a mix of products that we can use for cover-up, that we can use for items that can't be stitched easily, and that allow us to keep stock of inexpensive decorations that can be applied down the road. So patches have value both to us in production and to our clients as an object, as a collectible. The idea of collectible patches it has been around forever, spanning back from the idea of like metal badges. We're talking about pilgrims. We're talking about the era of Chaucer in England. When people went on religious pilgrimages, they would get these metal badges they'd pick up at each of the stations of their pilgrimage. From that until the national parks badges that are classic, that everybody's seen, where hikers have 1 million of these things stuck to their backpacks and stitched down, all the way up to the stuff we have now, where they show your affiliations, they show where you belong, who you belong to. They may show the city you're from and where you represent yourself. These things are collectible and they have meaning. So don't sell them as just an amalgamation of thread and polyester. Sell them based on the value of that identification. Sell them based on the value of the work that you do, the customization, and sell them as these objects that are so versatile. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and finish up here, guys. Let's cover some other stuff. I think we're going to come back to patches at some point. And I know there's some projects. I've been discussing some stuff with Brian Bailey of Embrilliance here, talking about software stuff that may be interesting on the patch front as we go on along with this stuff. So there's some things I'm sure I'm going to bring back in. This is not the last time for patches. This was a general overview where we dipped just slightly into everything. I can also see at some point that I'll probably do some deeper technique stuff with patches and maybe do some live software stuff to show you guys what I'm talking about, especially things like those tack downs and the way that I construct, say, a thread only patch. But that's the kind of stuff where you'd have to do that alone for the hour. So what I'm going to do for today, I'm going to call this off to some degree. I'm going to show you a couple things that I want to just kind of clean up and finish with, and then I will let you guys go. So let's go ahead and bring my screen back in for a minute. Yes, we have that lovely stuff from Printware where I showed how to sew stuff down. We've seen the multifunctional device. You want to see how this thing works? The MFS system, I'm actually going to throw this in the comments. You can see how this thing works. So this is pretty awesome. MFS system is cool. It's not for everybody. It's not for all methods, but it does show you some interesting things you can figure out with how to use that. I have found it to be an interesting option. Though personally, if you're talking about the quality of the patches, the 20 gauge vinyl patch, MFS patch, pretty equal. So you hooping up some vinyl and running the same file, these are exactly the same file, equal results. So I won't say that you have to have the MFS, but it does open up some new boundaries for you. So interesting stuff to look at from there. If you want to check out that blog post that is just kind of my overview of this stuff, I'm going to throw that in the comments right now as well. So in the comments, that is erichcampbell.com, how to make patches on any embroidery machine. So this is really an easy, quick overview. It doesn't have a lot of video content on it, but that is something, like I said, that we're going to come up to because patches are definitely in my future. And you'll also find how to get in on the patch trend, which shows you, as much as you might think it's dated from that period of time back, this is still going on right now. All these different methods for patch usage. And if you look in Printware magazine, I did an entire spread on patches on hats and the different kinds that are available. We didn't even get into things like woven patches or other kind of emblems. So definitely think about that. Go over to erichcampbell.com and check that out. And I'm going to throw this in the comments as well. So if you're here either on YouTube or Facebook, you'll be able to grab these in the comments. This is that story about the NHS fundraiser patches. I would love for you guys to take a look at that because I think that's something you guys could really get into. And the other thing I'm going to do is jump over to the Embrilliance website because here's something else that I'd like to point out. On our projects blog, you'll find that I have been giving away, and Lisa Shaw, who's our other awesome educator there, we have been giving away all these awesome things. My latest one is this veterinary caduceus, or actually, yeah, this is the rod of Asclepius, not the caduceus. Caduceus has wings and 2 snakes, but this is the veterinary rod of Asclepius. This is for veterinarians. It was specifically made for them to reward the veterinary people for giving their PPE to the people who are on the front lines in the healthcare industry. So because somebody had asked me to do that, I digitized this guy for veterinarians. But there are tons of designs out there that are medical, that are for fire and first responders, for EMS, for EMTs. If you guys want to take any of these, make patches, sell them, and make something for yourself and give your extra proceeds or profits off to your local people, this is absolutely something you can do. So get over the Embrilliance blog. If you see any of those designs you want to play with, put those on patches, add patch borders, sell those, do your own fundraiser. I would love to see you guys doing that stuff. So that's something that Embrilliance has been doing, and I want to keep this up. Stay strong and stitch on, everybody. Part of us staying strong, stitching on, is also doing good where we can. And patches are one of those ways, without having to get a bunch of apparel in, without having to do anything that costs us much more than supplies we have on hand, that we can create and we can make something useful for people. So think about patches as an option for that as you are staying strong and stitching on, and as you are stuck in the house, or maybe that your distributors aren't as easy to get to. I'd like to make one last run through the comments while we're here, and let's see what else we have. Cindy says, I think part 2 is needed. Yes, part 2, part 3, and part 4. There are so many badges, patches, and ways to handle this stuff. You have no idea. And even patch style designs that aren't patches, they can be put on things. There are all sorts of things I want to talk about with patches, and this is not the end of my patch, badge, and emblem rants. Can't help it. So love that stuff. And Mike says, a Draplin's thing tomorrow is going to have patches and collectibles content. Yes, Aaron Draplin, if you don't know the designer Aaron James Draplin, awesome dude. He was at ThreadX. If you're somebody who went to that ThreadX show I did this year, Draplin is awesome for making patches. He has really classic, very bold, thick lines, simple designs, but he sells fistfuls of them everywhere he goes. Patches are fantastic merch, especially when you think you can get a lot of quality and have a lower price point than a big item. And the funny thing is, you might end up with more profit built into it than you can imagine in comparison to a sized item that you have to stock multiple sizes. So if you're doing merch, patches are great merch, guys. So definitely think on that. Stephanie asks, any tips on mailing patches? If I use Etsy's default shipping, it costs $3.18 for a patch. It's less than an ounce. Yeah, no, I have done them in standard envelopes. In fact, that's one of the things I've done frequently when I'm trying to manage myself with items, or giveaway items too. Patches are great giveaway items because it absolutely is easy to stick those in an envelope and send them. I mean, certainly they're not going to be insured in a normal envelope, and you know, people like to have actual shipping done. But yeah, that's one of the things I love about patches. You can send them in an envelope and they get where they're going. So awesome stuff. And let's see, one last thing. Newbie here, Liz, newbie here, just soaking it all in. We love newbies here. And even if nobody else says they love newbies here, I love newbies here. So what I'm going to say is, always show up. Bring your newbie friends. Bring everybody. Everyone at every stage they're in belongs here, belongs in the embroidery world, belongs in apparel decoration, and has something to share. So we love newbies here, and we are always going to stay strong and stitch on. So guys, enough bonus time for the day. The take up for me today is, it's awesome to have you guys all here participating, and that I cannot wait to see what you make. Thank you to everybody who contributed and talked about their methods for working with that vinyl, how they handle things. Like I said, patches, very much like 3D foam, patches are one of those things where people have multiple ways to go about it. And as long as at the end you end up with a nice, clean edged emblem, all of these ways can be valuable, can be useful, depending on what you're trying to get out of the process. So that's my take up for today, and I'm so happy you guys could join, and I can't wait to see you again next week.